Each time we gather in this sacred place, we began those gatherings, those times, by lighting our chalice up here in the chancel. This is the chalice that was lovingly created for this congregation by John. And in continuing that tradition, we'll light our chalice now.
John believed in the power of communion, talking, eating, and sharing on the deepest levels. He helped to start and lead our men's group that continues with the same members almost 2 decades later. He understood the power of intimacy, the deep bonds that form from opening your heart and soul to each other. We are stronger as individuals when we knit our deepest selves together, and we live on through the fabric we knit into others. So we light this chalice today as we gather to share and connect with each other and remember John.
John Glick was born in Detroit, Michigan on July 1st, 1938, to Merle and Bill Glick, who had emigrated from Canada in the 1930s. As a kid, John was always making things with his hands. Whether it was dams in the creek or carts to ride on, young John could be found imagining and building. New ideas and solutions came spontaneously. His parents loved him just as he was, and recognizing a maker in their son, they encouraged his curiosity. Merle built a kiln out of bricks and fired it with charcoal, using a refrigerator shelf to hold his clay creations. The values John would be known for his entire life were instilled in him by these caring, attentive parents: to become honest, kind, fair, welcoming, curious, determined, energetic, compassionate, and moral. When asked how he became a potter, John once told an interviewer, it was by having parents that were very encouraging about everything that was called a hobby in those days. So whether it was a chemistry set in the basement, or making tree houses, or building go-karts from scrap lumber that we then pushed down the street, whatever I was doing, my parents were very supportive. I think this set up the background to discover a wonderful craft teacher in high school, Myrtle Monroe. She loved kids. She loved encouraging kids who wanted to try things. In her class, we learned basic metal smithing, soldering, enameling, leatherwork, pottery, and I tried them all. At that age, 15 to 16, I was most attracted to the metal and pottery work, which carried on from the hobby thing at home to working on crafts in high school. John studied ceramics and metal smithing in college, receiving his BFA in 1960 from Wayne State University. He went on to study with renowned ceramist Maya Grotel at Cranbrook Academy of Art, where he received his MFA in 1962. Following his studies at Cranbrook, Glick was drafted into the Army and sent to West Germany. According to an interview with Jody Klaus in American Craft magazine in 1991, Glick's interaction with several small traditional salt glazing potteries in Germany reinforced his intent to pursue full-time studio work rather than taking the path of teaching, which most of his peers did. When he returned to Michigan in 1964, Glick quickly established a studio and showroom under the name Plumtree Pottery, where he followed that pursuit for the next 50 years. He'd married his first wife, Ruby, while at Cranbrook. Their daughter, Margaret, was born in Germany in 1962, and Ian joined the family in 1971. In Farmington Hills, John gently influenced the customers who came to the studio by telling them what excited him, what he found challenging, aesthetic, and gratifying, so that they could develop along with him. John and Susie met at a pottery workshop in 1979 and married in 1980. John welcomed her children, Johnny and Amy, into his heart. From the beginning, Susie and John completed one another, forming a profoundly loving relationship. Susie herself was a potter, and they substantially enlarged their plum tree pottery studio together. She went on to become a high school ceramics teacher at Cranbrook Kingswood School, and then for the last 20 years of her career was a psychologist and counselor. Their 1870s farmhouse was the welcoming epicenter of their life, surrounded by a compound of buildings. Plumtree Pottery was eventually designated a historic site. Always John and Susie were partners in Plumtree Pottery, grounded in their love of each other and their love of clay. Susie recalls, "Coming through our gate, you entered another world, one completely John's making. It was a place of adventure, aesthetics, discovery, design, beauty, function, creativity, and pure delight. John loved going to work every day, often sprinting to the studio to pour his vast energy and imagination into his work. He created a unique and total experience for a visitor, one which harkened back to times where you could meet, learn from, and hang out with the person who had actually made, from start to finish, the very coffee mug you would then take home and bring to your lips for decades, or the dinner set that several generations would use. He loved that silent, intimate connection from his mind and his hands to your hands, your lips, your daily life." Over his career, John produced more than 300,000 pieces, including large wall hangings constructed with 2 hydraulic extruders he invented. He also mentored more than 30 younger potters whom he respectfully called artists in residence. As Rusty L. Eismont, John's assistant from 1972 to 1973, recalls, "I learned to mix clay and develop glazes. I make tools. I observe his reduction firing technique and learn the theory behind it. Each month, John produces hundreds of pots, while I struggle to find my voice with a few, firing some, reconstituting many. I discover that being a potter requires being a polymath, an ability to do and perform many things." Kristen Kiefer, who worked alongside John from 1996 to 1997, wrote, "The most important thing John taught me was to play. You can't work alongside a potter and glazer such as John without being inspired to shake off fear and explore." Peter Stone, a longtime admirer of John's, wrote, "I specifically remember John telling me how important it was to him that he was able to develop relationships with people through his art, and that he had so many special experiences with the people who owned and proudly displayed his art and often used daily his wonderful creations in their homes." John was generous with his teaching, his time, his playful sense of humor. A tribute prepared by a former assistant reads, "For many, his name conjures visions of thick, layered glazes that dress grand and strong ceramic forms with a lightness of brushwork and depth of color unsurpassed in American ceramics. For others, the name summons memories of dancing to blaring music around glaze buckets. inspecting, then drooling over the juiciness of a single drip of crystal-laden glaze from a salt firing, or returning to the studio from some small afternoon task to find a gigantic spoonful of peanut butter and chocolate patiently waiting on the wheel head to be enjoyed with delight. John's work can be found in many museums, including the Smithsonian's Renwick Gallery. Joan Mondale, wife of former Vice President Walter Mondale and an artist herself, wanted to educate our nation about fine American crafts. She invited the Senate wives to dine, and they all ate from Glick dinnerware. Later in December 1980, John got a call in his studio from Fritz Mondale, who commissioned another set as a gift for his wife for their 25th wedding anniversary, saying that John's pottery was the thing she missed most from her days in D.C. Exactly 1 year ago today, John experienced a profound satisfaction. A retrospective exhibit of his work entitled John Glick, A Legacy in Clay, was on display for 8 months at the Cranbrook Art Museum here in Bloomfield Hills. A very popular exhibit, attended by thousands, it included 250 pieces made during his half-century in ceramics. To know John throughout his life was to witness those values his parents instilled in him being put into action by what he said, what he did, what he made happen in the world. He rang true. He had a gift for friendship and deep relationship, which manifested in his leadership of the men's group he established here at Birmingham Unitarian Church, the congregation he and Susie joined in 1994, where they remained members until they moved to California last autumn. John was an active citizen in Farmington Hills, serving on the Area Arts Commission. He welcomed hundreds of tours to his studio over his career, everything from museum groups to scout troops to ceramic field trips. Students of all ages, anyone with an interest could arrange a visit. In addition, in Farmington, a visiting mayor from another city would be brought to Plumtree Pottery because John was the native son the city was so proud of. A characteristic which defined John was to engage a challenge head-on. He liked creating a problem so he could find its solution. In 1991, he had to wait 7 weeks for surgery on his spine. With his cat Agnes beside him on the bed, he purchased a used 4x5 camera and the books which would teach him how to use it. He mastered all the technicalities. Once he was well again, he designed a room where he could professionally photograph his own work using his knowledge and that old camera. John mostly worked in a series, never repeating, always exploring, ever pushing at that edge by asking his perpetual question, what if? A sense of play drove his discoveries. He had fun nudging every boundary. He was a genius who always kept a sketch pad by his bed. Many a night, Susie would awaken to his light at 3 a.m., with John drawing forms that he would make then later in the day. After breakfast, he'd go to his wood shop to fashion the tools required to create the piece he had drawn in the middle of the night. And so within half a day from having the original idea, he'd have created a whole series of pieces. This invigorated him. He generated ideas that then demanded of him a creative solution. Susie especially loved John's hands. They seemed able to do anything. A friend of a friend who looked at a photograph of John's strong, able hands said, "That's what God's hands must look like." John's creativity, generosity, and humor manifested in bedtime stories, too. He'd instruct the listener to name 3 things they'd like in their story. Say, a kite, a hippo, a basket of blueberries. And those would get woven into a storyline. Several generations loved John's bedtime ritual, and he also told stories to Susie, helping her get back to sleep at night. For a youngster, he'd turn a folded cloth napkin into a jumping rabbit. And if you were a dog, well, he'd get down on the floor and be a dog with you. Susie describes him as predictably delightful and delightfully unpredictable. If you didn't love him, it's probably because you just hadn't met him yet. His dear friend and ceramics collector Tim Mast said of him, John, or Juan, or Juani, was my favorite artist. His extraordinary spirit, creativity, playfulness, and presence is on our walls, on our dining table, in my garden. Perhaps most of all, John was just a wonderful, wonderful guy who always made me feel good. Anyone with too much awe and fuss about his reputation as an artist or the wondrousness of his work was quietly and quickly disarmed by John's humor and humility. To him, everyone was an equal. Peter Stone wrote, I remember whenever I was in his studio, I was emotionally overwhelmed by the amount of beauty in such a small space. Not just the magnificence of John's work, but also of his personality, his generosity with his apprentices and with people like me who were simply admirers. I told John this, and he told me that he understood how I felt. I was a little embarrassed by my admission, but I felt like I should tell him, and he didn't roll his eyes or laugh. He understood. I think maybe even appreciated what I said. And yes, John was wonderfully human too. He had his foibles. He couldn't spell worth a darn. He often got lost. Susie described him as geographically challenged. She said he loved a new environment because it brought freshness and discovery. Of course, he couldn't get himself there, and he couldn't get home either. But he could always find his way to your heart, every time. John was invited to teach intensive ceramics workshops in Australia, New Zealand, Hungary, China, Wales, and many states in the United States. But most of all, he just loved being home with Susie, with his family and friends, and back in the rhythm of his studio. And then once settled in their new, smaller home in Northern California, he loved the beauty and simplicity of their space, at last with opportunities for spontaneous family gatherings, holidays together, school and sports events, and all the fresh adventures awaiting him there. John honored Susie's request to relocate closer to her beloved children and grandchildren, and they moved just last October. Time with the California clan was precious. He also liked being in the woodshop at Rossmore, their large retirement community. He was content resolving challenges in their new home, like camouflaging 2 ugly cable boxes by building unique wood-burned and decorated cabinets. He joined a community circle at the Mount Diablo Unitarian Universalist Church. He attended men's group breakfasts. On his last day, he built a table and decorated a wall sconce to provide illumination in the guest room. John's heart had become a concern in 2011. Last summer, he had quadruple bypass surgery. John died quickly and unexpectedly this past April 6th. Unabashedly, unconditionally alive and in love with life, John especially loved Susie. He enjoyed time with his children, the stepchildren he loved as his own, and his 9 grandchildren, Olivia, Andrew, Mason, Zach, Natalie, Kenyon, Cody, Finn, Vivian, and great-granddaughter Tegan. With his death, the world of ceramics lost a pioneer and leader in the field. A renowned Minnesota potter said of John, "We've lost a giant." Husband, father, grandfather, friend, artist, maker, genius, lover of humanity, lover of play, John leaves a vast emptiness. He will be dearly remembered.
Everybody's wondering when and where we all come from. Everybody's worrying about where we're gonna go when the whole thing's done. No one knows for certain, so it's all the same to me. I think I'll just let the mystery be. Some say when you're gone forever. Some say you're coming back. Some say rest in the arms of Jesus, in simple ways you laugh. Some say coming back in a garden, bunch of carrots, some little sweet peas. I think I'll just let the mystery be. Everybody is wondering what and where we all come from. Everybody is worried where it's gonna be when the whole thing's done. No one knows for certain, so it's all the same to me. I think I'll just let the mystery be. Some say they're going to a place called glory. I ain't gonna say it ain't a fact. I've heard I'm on the road to purgatory, and I don't like the sound of that. I believe in love and I live my life accordingly. I need to let the mystery be. Everybody is wondering what and where we all come from. Everybody is worrying about where it's gonna be the whole thing's done. No one knows for certain, so it's all the same to me. I think I'll just let the mystery be. John lived his life with love. You felt it, you and me. And now John knows what the mystery be. Everybody's wondering what and where we all come from.
Good afternoon. I wanted to maybe take a little bit different tact and share with you what it was like to be raised in that household back in the 1960s, Apparently you can't hear me. I was raised in a really unique time by a pair of really unique people. If my parents weren't hippies, exactly they were the next best thing. John embraced everything, he embraced everything with a passion, and he really embraced the organic lifestyle before organic was a thing. We had the Whole Earth catalog. Many of you who are a little older may remember the Whole Earth catalog. It was dog-eared and well-loved. I see those of you with the gray hair nodding, yes. My parents let me read everything, so I read it too. We sent away to Walnut Acres for organic flour and dried fruit, and that was what we ate. My parents were very, very big on organic things. Well, my grandmother Merle took pity on me and would keep Captain Crunch and Oreos at her house. There has to be some balance, right? You've heard about the wonderful studio, and when I lived there as a child, it was the chicken coop form of the studio before the big studio was built. And so that was a little bit different. There was a lovely new subdivision that had gone in behind the farmhouse, and everybody that I knew who were children, their fathers, put on their gabardine suits and got their briefcases and went off to work every day. And my dad got up in the morning and put on his headband, that long red hair, and a chambray shirt and his denim jeans, and he went out to the backyard of the chicken coop to play all day. So that was different. Going to the elementary school in that little subdivision, my teachers would find out that there was this artist living right up the street. So they would ask to come to our house to have a field trip. Okay, that sounds great. But being a child whose name appears on the permission slip and your house is the destination for the field trip, okay, you can laugh, but I didn't think it was so funny at the time. It's like being on display, like you're going to the zoo, only you're going to the plum tree pottery. But he really enjoyed, as you've heard, teaching all of those little workshops and having those kids visit the studio. And I've heard since he passed from kids that I went to school with how much they enjoyed that experience, and that they still have memories of working with the clay and making those small little pots at those visits. So that was a special time. A couple of other things that you may remember if you think back to the studio, if you know, is that there was always a studio cat. We had a cat for many years named Cassandra. She was a calico. I see a few nods from my cousin. A couple litter of kittens that were born in the towel drawer there. And if you were an early studio assistant there, you might remember that there was some pheasant that met an untimely end, and became some wonderful brushes in the studio. So I doubt that'll like you. Well, one evening, John was firing the kiln, and you all know who have been around that the firing goes on 24-hour cycles, so you have to go out at night. Well, one night, Dad was walking out, or back from, the studio after having checked on the kiln, and he felt something brush up against his leg, and bent down and picked it up, thinking it was the studio cat, but it was a skunk. And he walked into the house and said to my mother, "I think I've been sprayed by a skunk." That was her first hint. They tried to get the smell out. I think they bought out all the tomato juice in the area, but we ended up burying the boots, and that was the end. So there was always definitely humor. You've heard that John was humorous, and it embarrassed me. It embarrassed me to no end as a child. The jokes, the puns. My earliest pun that I remember, the one that is stuck in my head, was, "What fruit has to have a formal wedding?" Anyone? The can't elope. What a grammar, you get the drift. So John has passed along to us, and I hope we've passed along to our kids, the love of a good joke. He was a very early NPR listener, for those of you, and has made, I think, myself and my kids, so that's at least 3 generations of NPR lovers. Music was always important, so I know he'd be very happy to have some handmade music here today. I remember when we were growing up, he was part of a group that played acoustic folk music, went around to different people's homes and played together. We went to the Raven Gallery, listened to Barbara Barrow and Mike Smith, Jacques Brel, and that was important. Music was always very important to him, and that was something that he passed along to the family as well. Thank you for coming today, and I hope you enjoyed a little bit of the remembrances that I had growing up. Thank you.
Wow. My name is Bill Hunt, and I was the editor of Ceramics Monthly magazine for many years, which is how I started to get to know John. And Dr. Hurt has laid out a lot of the landscape of just how important John was as a person, as a potter. In fact, I don't think I know anybody who lived life as well, who lived such a great life as John. And in many respects, I have a feeling that he's the example for a great many of us in this room for where we might shoot for if we can do our part in this life. I consider John among the most important full-time studio potters of all time. I want to make sure that everybody knows that, because here's the local potter, and you know how we think about that. He wasn't just a local potter. I think he was probably the most significant American full-time studio potter. I can't think of anybody that had more influence all the way around. And if you're lucky enough to have one of his pieces, I think you really are particularly lucky, because you've got a piece of abstract expressionism that I don't think has been fully recognized by the art world, but I think eventually it definitely will be. I was looking at these three beautiful pieces up and thinking, each one of those represents 100,000 pieces that he made. How about that? Who can even begin to say that? Listening to Dr. Hurt, I was thinking about the bravery of starting a potter in the early 1960s, at a time when there were teaching jobs, and that was the easy way that people took, because you could get that nice salary, and then you could go on and do your thing. But doing it full-time was a big challenge, and there weren't very many people that were willing to do that, and he did. Further, he didn't follow the changing trends that went on in the field. He stuck with his game, always his game. And I think of John as a giver of gifts that he gave to all of us. Not just the gifts of his pots, but the gifts of his humor. I think if he were here today, he'd be throwing out little heart-shaped pancakes into the audience. He gave away all his processes and ideas by writing and doing workshops. He was the first one to tell you about what he was doing when the rest of the field was keeping secrets and saying, "Oh, I discovered this and I'm not going to tell anybody about this. This is my secret process." He was just the opposite. I think about John's intellect, absolutely top flight. His inquisitiveness. I don't know anybody who was more inquisitive than John. I mean, it just ran him all the time. His playfulness. It was just the way he worked. How nice to be able to play for a living. Wouldn't we all like to do that? Sometimes I think if everybody in the world did what they were really intended to do, then the people who are in the jobs that they hate those jobs, somebody who would like that job would be in it. I think about his artistry, of course. In many respects, John opened a new branch of abstract expressionism. Sure, it was based on a painting movement out of New York City. It's a very American movement, and John was a very American potter. But the branch that he developed was something involving both form and decoration. I think of all of his works as little paintings or little sculptures with very important surfaces. I'd like to know, just for fun and just for your edification too, how many people in this room are potters or have enjoyed working with ceramics sometime along the way? Stick your hand up if that's true. Oh my goodness. Isn't that lovely? That's a pretty good example right there of what he's done. John said, as a student, my dream was to live within and enhance my community through making works that I cared deeply about, and he sure did that. I think if John were with us today, we want to give him a standing ovation, and that's what I recommend that we do right now.
My name is Julia Walther. I was John Glick's final resident of over 30 residents, and I worked with him from 2012 to 2014. My experience of John was that he was always brimming with a steady exuberance, a sun's worth of energy that manifested itself in his sense of play and in dreaming up new ways to make his life and his work more delightful. While he would stop as you've heard, he would stop mid-pot to invent a gadget to bring forth a new idea. John always took the extra time to make the small moments in between work worth savoring. In the 2 years I spent in the studio with him, I can't count how many times he brought us each a round silver spoon full of crunchy peanut butter with exactly 3 chocolate chips on top for a mid-afternoon snack, or recall how many groan-worthy jokes and puns he covered our working time with. He was really an improv partner. He always said yes and to whatever situation arose, and took immense pleasure in the conspiratorial delight of it all. He charmed everyone he encountered, bank tellers, letter carriers, friends and colleagues, making them all part of his wacky tribe. All through his play, though, I could see the gravity of John's vocation, making thousands of glowing pots. The balance he struck between dreaming and doing, levity and discipline, self-assuredness and self-exploration were all so striking to me as a young person. And just 3 years out, I know there's still so much from my time with him that I still haven't begun to understand. Even though Susie is the head gardener in the family, John was a gardener in his own right, of ideas, of people, and of his life. He planted seeds, he sheltered them, and took daily care to cultivate and protect them, and he had the patience to get them to blossom through humor, experimentation, and love. The bigness and fearlessness of his life was built up of all of these small works and decisions that he made with such confidence, warmth, tenderness, and playfulness, the sun, pouring light and energy into every corner. As I move through my days with his work in our home, I like to think of the pieces he's left behind as these fully charged solar cells that we still get to enjoy the power of his warmth and joy. They still have that power. The examples he set for me in his relationships with his loved ones, his sense of duty to foster future generations of potters, and dedication to following his impulses and instincts to make the best pots possible are invaluable and lasting gifts. I'm so happy to hear about the creation of the Penland Endowment in his name, which will be a wonderful way to beam John's light into the next generations of artists. So even though his star has burned out, we here on Earth still have years to bask in his warmth through his loved ones, his legacy, and the gifts we can create for others to honor his dedication to daily work, daily moments of delight, and a tireless pursuit of creating art and joy. Thank you.
As a grouchy 14-year-old, the last thing I wanted was a new stepfather. But John had a gentle, calm, and lighthearted way of winning people over. Even though I tried with determined teenage persistence, I couldn't find very much to dislike about him. For one thing, there was his sense of humor, which has been referenced many times already. Every meal or outing was peppered with puns, even when they were long shots or just plain bad. I had to admire his dapper. His offbeat attempts to brighten the mood came in strange and creative ways. I remember the day he came back from shopping and announced that the supermarket was selling a new product, pre-sliced bananas. He proceeded to reach into a grocery bag and pull out an unpeeled banana, just like this one. We get too many hands here. And so he opened it, and pre-sliced. We pestered him all afternoon until he finally admitted it was a hoax and showed us the secret to his trick. John's imagination was most apparent in the pottery studio. Each morning he would set off across the backyard, eager to plunge in and try out his new ideas. Incredible creations emerged from the kiln. I loved poking through the kitchen cupboard to discover the mug or bowl that spoke most clearly to me, and then making sure it ended up on my placemat. The next day, John went back to create more. Seeing how passionate he was about his work and how he found a way to thrive as a working artist helped me to believe that I could succeed at my own dream of becoming an independent filmmaker. Just as John loved his work, he also loved my mom. For almost 4 decades, I saw the profound devotion they shared and the ways they fully accepted each other for who they were. Their delight, care, and support for each other served as an inspiration for me and for so many others who knew them. Even though he is no longer here, I know that the memory of the love they shared will envelop my mom for the rest of her life. John modeled a form of manhood that is far too rare today. He embodied kindness, patience, dedication, creativity, hard work, humor, and acceptance. Just as John taught these core values to me, I have tried to pass them on to my own sons. Each night, as we eat off his plates, pour from his pitcher, drink from his cups, we touch his joyful and creative spirit and keep it alive in the world.
Why can't I? melts like a lemon drops high above the chimney top. That's where you find me, oh, somewhere over the rainbow, way up high. The dreams that you dare to, why, oh why can't I trees of green and red roses too, I watch them bloom for me and you, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Well, I see skies of blue and I see clouds of white and the brightness of day. I like the dark and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky, are also on the faces of people passing by. See friends shaking hands, singing, how do you do? They really say, I love you. I hear babies cry and I watch them grow. They'll learn much more than we'll know, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky, are also on the faces of people passing by. See friends shaking hands, singing, how do you do? They really say, I love you. I love you. I hear babies cry and I watch them grow. They'll learn much more than we'll know, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. What a wonderful
As we prepare to close the service, just a couple of instructions for you. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to stand while I say the benediction. And then I'll ask everyone except those who are seated with the family to sit back down so that I can escort the family out so they'll be prepared to greet you. And then the ushers are going to come invite you to exit row by row. That'll ensure that we move gracefully into the reception. You're all invited to stay for a reception that will be, you can stay indoors and go into the reception in the hall, or you can go out in the courtyard and there'll be beverages out there. So now please stand as you're able and join hands for the benediction. And now may the courage of the early morning's dawning and the strength of the eternal hills and the peace of the evening's ending and the love that never dies be in our hearts to bless us this day and forevermore. Amen. Please be seated.